Apple is changing stuff. We just had WWDC. Welcome to Fort Knox Live. We are going to break it all down. What really matters out of that conference? I am Jon Fortt here at the NASDAQ market site in New York's Times Square, and I'm joined by just a couple people you would want if you wanted to talk about what happened at WWDC. CNBC's own Josh Lipton joins us from San Francisco, and Gene Munster of Loop Ventures, a longtime Apple watcher as well. So, guys, welcome to both of you. Apple is in spring cleaning mode, is the way I look at it. I mean, usually they're rolling out new looks or dramatic new features in iOS, which is the operating system behind the iPhone and iPad. But this time, they took a slower approach, fixing some bugs. Gene, what was your major takeaway from this announcement as far as what it means for Apple users?
Well, the keynote this year was particularly more focused on the users. Typically, it's kind of a 60% users about new features coming. 40% of that keynote is devoted to developers and new tools. That this year was probably more like 80-20, 80% focused on the users. And I think the key takeaway here is Apple sees an opportunity to take advantage of some of the misfortunes, I think, of Facebook around data privacy and usage, and really emphasize that they want to be customer first. The customer is always right. They want to enrich people's lives. And so the majority of announcements, 8 of the 10, were related to enriching your lives, whether it was a do not disturb embed feature or shortcuts, things like that. So that was my biggest takeaway, is Apple wanted to draw a very hard line between themselves, who makes money on selling hardware predominantly, and the other players, Google and Facebook.
Now, Josh Lipton, a cynic would say Apple lately, over the past couple of years, has sort of given up on bold new designs in phones. iPhone 10 notwithstanding. I mean, the 8 and 8 Plus look like the 7, look like the 6, and now they're not even coming out with new software looks. I mean, what are they doing?
I thought a couple points. One, I think Gene nails it. I mean, we were both there. I think Gene was inside, I was outside, but we're both at the conference this year. I think you couldn't help but notice they were clearly trying to draw very, very clean lines between themselves and the competition, not so subtle jabs at Facebook, which I think is interesting because obviously these guys don't compete very directly. Apple doesn't have a social network, and some of its rivals. Google actually writes big checks to Apple, but it's an interesting point to drive home privacy, to drive home, as Cook has always said, that it's a human right, especially if you're going to, if you're Tim Cook and you're driving into more sensitive areas like healthcare. They do have the new health records product that they've talked about. If you're going to do that, you have to convince people that you are this trusted custodian and guardian of data. So I think it strategically makes sense why he's moving there. And then I think, to your point, John, as one analyst put it,
Josh,
maybe
let me
this year wasn't
interrupt here.
about.
A quick question for you. Josh, let me interrupt. When they showed the, you talked about that hard line, did it catch your attention when they brought out the Instagram example around too much usage or how much time you're on it? And I think Facebook, in terms of some of the tracking, that obviously was well placed. And I guess, did it catch your attention?
Yeah, no, it was about as subtle as a sledgehammer. I think you're absolutely right, Gene, and it was meant to be. And you saw that, obviously anti-tracking features were strengthened in Safari. I mean, they are trying to drive this very hard line here that's not our business. We're not data miners. We're not monetizing your data. It is different. And like I said, I think there are strategic reasons they should do that. And then in terms of John's point about the software, I think maybe, as one analyst put it, it wasn't about big splashy announcements, but there were some important, I thought, upgrades that they didn't make, John, to Siri, to their digital assistant.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to go next, is starting to break down some of these changes that they are making. One of the major ones with Siri is Siri shortcuts, which, I mean, I'm not sure how much of this is understanding what you're saying in the classic sense, but basically you're able to say certain phrases and have Siri do a whole bunch of things at once. Siri, I'm headed home, and then your various systems know that means to set your thermostat at a certain level at home, et cetera, et cetera. Gene, for the power Apple user who's using the Home app and has all these various gadgets online and has a home pod and wants to put on a tune at home and all that stuff, this makes sense. But for the mainstream Apple user who's maybe just got a couple of Apple devices, how useful is Siri shortcuts going to be versus just making Siri itself a bit smarter and able to understand some of the basic things that I'm saying?
Our bet is 20% of iPhone owners actually implement some of these Siri shortcuts. It is an important distinction to make about what Apple is doing here. Is historically, and before I get more into it, think of it as 20%. Majority of people are still going to be largely hands-off. But this is an important shift in terms of how Apple is presenting their product. In the past, it's been Android on one side, which is kind of a lot of user control, and you can really go and turn the dials and tweak the OS and more user control. And on the other side is the walled garden around iOS. Don't bother me with the tech. I want a phone that works really well. That has historically, for the last 10 years, been the iPhone versus Android. And what shortcuts is, it's the first time, really, that Apple has said, we're going to allow people to do a little bit more of their own customization around the phone. And so there is a group, probably about 20%, I'm in that group, that is really excited about what that can do in terms of using voice to have more control and kind of streamline how you use your phone. But eventually, they need to go and do this for the majority, that other 80%.
And I wonder, Gene, that's what I'm getting at, though, is that this feels to me to some degree like an allowance for the fact that Siri can't understand me saying, hey, Siri, I'm heading home, so turn the thermostat down or up to whatever, 70 degrees, and by the way, put on my favorite song when I come in the door. Siri would say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're talking about. So I have to go in and set that up and set up a phrase that Siri does understand in order to get Siri to do that. I mean, isn't that part of what's going on here?
Yeah, with shortcuts, you can, in fairness to shortcuts, you can do one command that triggers multiple things. So you could say, I'm going home, and at that point, your roommate is texted, your thermostat gets changed. This is the example they gave, and driving directions come up. So that part is something that the user has to be. But what you're getting at is a bigger issue with Siri, and we monitor and test this closely. We do 800 queries twice a year with Siri and HomePod and the other competitors, and it tends to do worse. It gets it right about 55% of the time. Google Home is the best. It gets it right about 83% of the time. But the message here is that they need to open up Siri domains. And right now, there's just a few areas that Siri is open to developers. And the experience that you described was could be solved by Apple opening up the domains. Now, 3 strikes and I'm out on this. I've predicted 2 times now that Apple would open up their domains. They haven't done it yet, so I hold hope that eventually they will open up some of these Siri domains. But this is an important area around voice, and Apple needs to pick up their game on Siri.
Gene, I think they're going to do that right around the time they come out with a standalone television. That's when
let me ask,
long-time Gene Munster fans will understand that reference. Josh?
I wonder, Gene, when he talks about opening up Siri to more apps and new categories, Gene, when you talk about these domains, what would be, because Gene and I were actually going back and forth about this before the conference, and when you think about a new category, Gene, so now it's like it's payments, it's messaging, it's fitness. When you think about a new domain, a new category, what would be one that you wish they had said, they wish they had opened up Siri to?
Well, I think commerce is one. Information is another. So when you can't say to Siri, order me a pizza through Domino's, now you can do a version of that with Alexa. So I think the commerce domains is an area that they're particularly weak on. Another area is just location-based services, to be able to ask Siri to bring up different types of apps like Waze, for example. They're opening up Google Maps and Waze for Car OS. So that would be another area. And then the last piece that I was really surprised that they didn't do, that they could easily have done, which is integrating Siri with Spotlight. Spotlight is an app on iOS and on desktop that basically goes and it's a search tool. Really powerful. You could say, I'm looking for a PDF that uses this phrase inside the PDF, and it would help you find that. But that would be an easy way. Imagine being able to say to Siri, pull up my latest Apple model, and then I don't have to worry whether it's on my desktop or in iCloud and try to find it, because I'm not really great at keeping things organized on my desktop, so that would be an easy. It was a miss for Apple, and I love the company. I think they're doing a lot of stuff right, but there are some easy things around Siri that I think they can still improve.
Now, speaking of things that Apple changed, we haven't really dug deep on screen time, though, Gene, you did mention it, and that's this new experience that you understand how much time you're spending in various apps, maybe set some limits for yourself and for kids. Let's listen and watch that part of the keynote and give some analysis as we go. Here's Apple launching screen time.
Now I'd like to take a moment to talk about something that's on a lot of people's minds lately. You know, iPhone and iPad are some of the most powerful tools ever created for learning, exploring, and keeping in touch. But some apps demand more of our attention than we might even realize. They beg us to use our phone when we really should be occupying ourselves with something else. They send us flurries of notifications, trying to draw us in for fear of missing out. And some of us, it's become such a habit that, we might not even recognize just how distracted we've become. Well, we've thought deeply about this. And today, we're announcing a comprehensive set of built-in features to help you limit distraction, focus, and understand how you're spending your time, and balance the many things that are important to you. Now, it starts with Do Not Disturb. There are times of the day, or times when you just don't want to be disturbed, and one of those, of course, is at night. Sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night and you look at your phone, maybe just to check the time, and you're confronted with something like this. Barrage of notifications that spin you up and keep you from falling back asleep. And so we're introducing Do Not Disturb during bedtime, where all you'll see is this, nothing to get you spun up. And in the morning, in the morning, when you wake up, you're gently eased into your day. You can tap when you want to start confronting those notifications. Next, I want to talk about notifications. Now, notifications help keep us informed and connected to important things that happen throughout the day. And we'd like to give you more control over how many notifications you receive. And so we're enabling what we call instant tuning for notifications right from the lock screen. You can press in to a notification, and from there you can decide to send future notifications from that app directly to Notification Center, bypassing your lock screen, or turn them off altogether. And Siri will even help by suggesting that you turn off notifications for apps that you're no longer using. Now, we also wanted to give you help managing large numbers of notifications. So I'm thrilled to announce that we're bringing to iOS support for grouped notifications. Notifications are grouped not just by app, but also by topic and thread. It gives you a great overview of the notifications you've received. You can tap in and look at a particular group, but of course, just as important, with a single swipe, you can triage a whole group of notifications away. We wanted to go further, and it's with a feature we call Screen Time. Screen Time empowers you with both insight and control over how you spend your time. And it starts with reports. Every week, you get a weekly activity summary that details how you used your iPhone or iPad. You tap in, and you get to view your full activity report. It's really detailed. You get deep insight on how much time you're spending, where you're spending it, and even how your use breaks down during the day or the night. You get a summary of the time you're spending in apps, how much time you're spending, how often per hour you're picking up your phone and what's drawing you in, and what apps are sending you the most notifications. Now, equipped with this insight, you can make decisions about how much time you want to spend with your device each day. But we know there are people who would like a little extra help in managing their use of apps. And for them, we've created app limits. So if in your activity report, you see an app where you might want to be spending a little bit less time, well, you can set your own limit. And then during the day, when you're using the app, you'll receive a helpful notification letting you know time is almost up. And once you've reached your limit, instead of the app, you'll see this. It's time to move on. Now, we'll let you grant yourself an extension if you want, but we'll give you a reminder later to move along. Now, this is also in sync across your iPhone and iPad, so your limits apply to your total usage.
Well, why didn't they just call it methadone, guys? We're in this weird position where we're using tech to help us manage the fact that we're using tech too much. And this strikes me as a theme across not just Apple, but much of what's going on in social right now. You know, Facebook facing this backlash over its use of data when the whole concept behind Facebook has to do with giving you their data and, you know, them sharing it out with other apps and experiences. Gene, get big picture for us here. What is it that the technology industry is trying to respond to, trying to do based on what's happening in the culture? And do you think this will be successful?
Well, the big thing they're trying to do is recognize that privacy, data privacy, is gone out of control, and people want to reel that in. It just is weird for people. They get creeped out about how their data is used. So that's one kind of island of this conversation. And the second island has been one that's emerging just around screen time. It has everything, impacts everything from people not connecting with each other face to face to potential damage to your eyes and just a change in terms of our culture. We've all experienced, been at a restaurant, been at a table, or observed a table where a group of people are supposedly eating together, but in fact they're just on their phones. And I think that it's just reached a point where something needs to be done. The unfortunate reality here is that people are going to prefer to still use their devices a lot. And this will, in fact, let them, for probably a small group of people, be aware that the amount of usage that they're going to have. It will make Apple feel better that they're at least giving tools to people to make some of these decisions, but it's not going to change the substance of it. The area that it would change the substance of it, and I mentioned this in a message too, is this idea of activity monitoring by parents and kids, because the kids thing is a big deal. Kids get addicted to these. We all know that.
Right. And Amazon has had some of this for a while.
Yeah, Amazon's had some, and I mean, a lot of tech platforms have had it, but this idea of monitoring, one thing that is real and some substance that came out of WWDC is the idea of activity monitoring by parents. That's the worst thing to happen to a 12-year-old since vegetables. I mean, they do not want to touch a kid. That is actually going to have an impact. Parents are going to have more influence in terms of the amount of device usage. And so I think that piece is at least going to make parents feel better about owning an Android or Apple device. I'm sure both of them are going to eventually have that.
Josh Lipton, I want to get your take on this big picture before we bring in a guest that I'm excited about. Apple, with this latest cycle, had the iPhone X, also the 8 and the 8 Plus. They kept around the iPhone 6S, you know, and the SE. For the first time, they had this huge family of devices at prices from the $300 plus range all the way up through $1,000. And the message at the stores was, don't try to get people necessarily to buy an iPhone X. It's not for everybody. Just let them find an iPhone that they love. At the same time, they're saying, well, don't necessarily buy the latest phone on schedule. They seem to be saying, oh, and by the way, you can use your iPhone less. Why are they doing this?
So I think a couple points. One, I think Gene is totally nails it, and digital well-being is this important hot button topic that Apple wants to address. I think Apple isn't necessarily saying how much time you should spend on your phone, right? They're just saying, well, listen, we're going to give you information and more hard data, and then you decide, you self-regulate what you think is appropriate, how much time to spend in those apps. And I was interested in one point Gene made, which I think was interesting, because, you know, John, we talk, whenever you have an Apple bull on CNBC, someone who's very confident about the stock, so much of that is about that, the faster-growing, higher-margin services business. And I want to get Gene's take. He does think maybe in some way this impacts services. I just was wondering Gene's take on, you know, big deal, no deal. What do you think?
Before we get Gene's take, I want to bring in Bruce Tognazzini of Nielsen Norman Group. He is a design expert, user interface design expert, been watching Apple for a long time, used to work at Apple, was employee number 66. Bruce, welcome to Fort Knox Live. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So what is your take on the reasons why Apple did what it did at WWDC. The way it's driving developers. I mean, sure, they had a number of glitches in the software over the past year. There was maybe this sense that it was too feature-heavy before clean and bug-free. But then there's also this stuff mixed in around trying to get people more information about how they're using devices. What does this mean from the user's perspective?
Well, I think it probably grew out of the problem of kids and parents, and then they just decided to make it generalized. It was interesting, the remark about it being methadone. They've created a very addictive device. It's so good, it's addictive. And now they're trying to take steps to protect people's health, their mental health and their physical health. So I think it's an excellent move. I think it's good for their image. So it's all to the good, and it's not clear how many adults that have the freedom to look at things excessively will actually use the feature.
Apple started offering carrot sticks instead of fries, but for some reason we're not all that much slimmer. Gene?
Yeah, I do believe, so I've historically been positive on Apple, so you need to take my next comment into context of being a longtime bull here. But I do believe that Apple has a goal of truly enriching people's lives. I mean, they want to create great products, but I think it's authentic when they want to respond to parents' concerns about the usage. And I think they're okay with the idea that some usage may be negative, a decline in usage may be negative for parts of their business. And I think that's a sign that they do have, I guess, wholesome motivations, I think, when it comes to this device usage question.
So as we look through some of the other announcements, in watchOS 5, which is a new operating system behind the watches, a couple things caught my eye. One, the walkie-talkie feature. I mean, they had a bunch of health stuff, but we all expected that. Walkie-talkie feature where basically you talk and it kind of pops up on somebody else's watch, kind of reminiscent for those who are old enough to remember of the Nextel push-to-talk days. Bruce, do you think that signals something about the maturity of the wearable industry, or where Apple sees the watch, given kind of that we saw the phone starting to do these kinds of things, what was it, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think to a great extent they brought out the watch without really knowing what was going to be a hit on it, what were going to be the killer apps. And so we're seeing this evolution towards more and more health stuff, fitness stuff. And I don't know, I've wanted a two-way wrist radio since I was a child, looking at Dick Tracy. So I think it's interesting. And you can message somebody, and so essentially we do this already using quick text messages. It's much easier to talk into an Apple Watch than to try to compose text. So we'll see how much people use it. I'm not sure anybody knows yet.
But Josh Lipton,
it's sure a fun feature.
We love the Dick Tracy idea, but I mean, people are annoyed by phone calls these days because the phone rings and then people want to talk. I mean, what's more intrusive than somebody calling you through your watch? The phone, it doesn't even have to ring, they just start talking to you.
I'm with you, John.
Very limited situations, maybe I'm at a theme park with my kids, where I'd want to have that feature enabled.
Yeah, so I guess
park, it's going to be too loud.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Push to talk.
In the theme park, it's going to be too loud.
Go ahead, Josh.
To hear it.
I guess one man's annoyance could be another man's form of entertainment, and those kind of short-voiced memos, I think, sort of speaks to maybe how Apple sees the watch, how it sees the use cases being different now than the phone. I agree, John. I thought the watchOS presentation, Apple's Kevin Lynch was on stage. I thought that was one of the more interesting parts. How they framed the watch is obviously a big push still. This is a health and fitness device, so you saw changes there about connectivity. Shout out to the Apple employee who did a demo while riding a bike. That was impressive. And also a device, you know, it's interesting because we don't get a lot of hard numbers on that device from Apple. I mean, you don't get units, you don't get revenue. They speak broadly about it on their last earnings call. They said, you know, revenue was still growing double digits. And so you're left with third-party reports, which actually show a lot of strength. I mean, IDC says they shipped 18 million watches last year, and they took the lead in that category. So it would seem like Apple's pretty well positioned here at this point in wearables.
Gene, remember the days? The days when the iPod first came out and Apple was so small that within just a couple of quarters they started having to report units because it was what we call in the financial world material to their overall revenue. These days, you've got the watch, you've got AirPods, you've got Amazon's Echo devices. We still have no unit numbers on these things, partly because the companies behind them are so massive.
Yeah, they're massive. They do give us a little bit of a breadcrumb trail to follow. As Josh mentioned, it's pretty high level. They did throw us a little bit of a bone at WWDC, saying the watch grew 60% last year. I was a believer that the watch was going to have a faster start than it did, and in fact, it did not have a good start, but it's starting to pick up momentum, and I think the big takeaway for us, it's roughly 3% of Apple's total business today, but I think the big takeaway is when the smartphone came out, it was a shift from a phone to a computer in your pocket. Very simple visual there. And I think now the Apple Watch is a point where I think we can comfortably say this is a computer on your wrist, and that opens up a lot of opportunities beyond walkie-talkie, and it's really endless about how app developers can continue to leverage this increasingly powerful hardware. So I'm optimistic that eventually they will break out that Apple Watch number because it's going to be to a point where it's going to be a big enough part of their business.
Bruce Tognazzini, I want you to spend some time talking about the Mac because a few things that I noticed. They revamped the Mac App Store, trying to make it more like the iOS App Store. They put group FaceTime on the Mac, similar to what they also announced for iOS. Also, they're talking about being able to port iOS applications to the Mac. Is the Mac becoming a kind of sidecar in a way to the iPhone and to, well, not really to the iPad because that hasn't been a grower? What is happening philosophically and kind of user-wise with the Mac? Are they trying to make it more familiar to the iPhone users so that they buy more Macs?
I think that's exactly what they're doing. And the sad thing is for those of us who really want to use a real computer is that they've been making it more and more difficult to use the Mac as a real computer. For example, serious applications can't appear in the Mac Store because to be in the Mac Store, you have to essentially be a baby application with very limited ties into the system. So, yeah, it's great for sales. It's great for stockholders. It's not necessarily great for those of us who really depend on that extremely powerful tool to get our work done.
Also want to talk about the security features that Apple is building into Safari. It's interesting. Do we have time for this part or no? I want to listen to the. We don't. But let's talk about it. Josh, I think it was Craig Federighi who was on stage talking about how the like buttons and the comment boxes across the web actually enable companies like Facebook, though we might not have mentioned them specifically, to track your activity even when you don't realize it, and that Safari is shutting that down. You alluded to that earlier. How big an impact is that going to have on Apple's relationships with those companies, and then on the user experience of, say, Facebook users who now maybe will have to worry a little bit less about being tracked?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that was a big part of Federighi's presentation. You know, we discussed that earlier. I think they've drawn a very clear line in the sand here. They, as a company, will argue they simply have different values. Both Cook and Federighi have pointed out we, have a different business. We're not in the ad business, and they think by, kind of strengthening these anti-tracking features now, that is going to be better both for their users, for their company, and yeah, it's a line in the sand with themselves and some of their at least big tech peers here in Silicon Valley, and one they can draw because their business model obviously hardware driven, unlike, let's say, a Facebook or a Google.
I wonder whether it's going to work because up to this point, The browser play has been exactly the opposite. Google and before them Yahoo, and they were coming out with their own special browser toolbars, and then eventually browsers themselves to tie you more into their data-driven systems. Chrome is actually giving Google more data. Here's a browser that's built on the idea of giving less data. We will see. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me for Fort Knox Live to talk about Apple, the Worldwide Developer Conference keynote, some of the big announcements out of that. Josh Lipton, Gene Munster, and Bruce Tognazzini. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
On the Fort Knox podcast this week, Scott Wagner, the CEO of GoDaddy. Talk about a cultural transformation that company has been through as they've transitioned from just trying to get attention into actually trying to build a deeper, more meaningful relationship with the small business customer base. And that means no more risque models in their commercials, among other things. Be sure to check that out, fortknox.com, on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, all the places where you get your